Welcome to the second part of the KNAV State of Governance series that tracks the winds of change impacting companies in India. In the first KNAV State of Governance debate, I had identified some burning questions, issues that had been voiced by the industry in relation to two significant legislative developments. The first was in the context of internal financial controls, the assessment of which seeks to detect and prevent fraud. And the second was in relation to the adoption of Ind AS, which facilitates greater transparency in financial reporting. What we saw in that debate was the fact that the bane of corporate governance issues in India is not in the legislation itself. The real problem lies in the administration and monitoring of the legal framework, apart from the moral and ethical framework in the context of which business decisions are taken. And these are precisely the aspects which form the subject matter of our discussion today, to which I am very pleased to welcome an extremely distinguished panel. Sitting on my left is K.K. Mistry. He is the Vice Chairman and CEO of HDFC. Sitting on my right is Robin Banerjee, the Managing Director of Caprihans. Sitting on Robin's right is Atul Deshmukh. He is the Global Leader for the Assurance Practice of KNAV. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today. Let me first turn to you, K.K. Could you please outline some specific good governance practices that relate to the moral and ethical framework of the board level committees, and also the management of banks?
The board is really the key. The shareholders look to the board to guide them, to sort of protect their interest, and the board's role is really to protect the interest of the shareholders. Management prepares strategy. That the role of the board then is to oversee the management, see what is happening, and provide the guidance whenever it is necessary. And therefore, the functioning of the board is very critical. One of the most critical things is the appointment of the directors. Who are the kind of directors you need to have on board? So you need people with experience. You need people with some degree of knowledge of finance. You need some people with knowledge of marketing. You need some people with technical knowledge. And then you need a whole lot of people who, and everyone has to be committed to governance. A lot of time is spent by the board today to look at compliance rather than to really look at strategy. And I think that is something which we need to sort of relook at. The important thing is to have diversified views. So board members must have different views, and those views must be expressed very freely. The chairman should be a person who is able to extract those views from different people, and even if there are differing views, he should be able to arrive at some sort of a consensus at the end of the meeting. And I think that was what distinguishes a good board from a not good board. Strategy is also very important. So do you look at short-term strategy? Do you look at long-term strategy? Now, ultimately, in the interest of shareholders, you have to look at the long term. You cannot look at the next quarter or the quarter after that. So a long-term strategy is important. Long-term goals are important. Sometimes long-term goals come at the expense of short-term benefit. But in the long term, they obviously serve their purpose. Risk management. Risk management is again something which is very critical. And I think any good risk management system, and there must be board oversight on risk management, any risk management system should be such that in good times you should be able to take advantage, clear some kind of a buffer which can be used when there is a downturn. And sometime in the course of the economy, there will be some kind of a downturn. So I think these, and culture is also very important, because at the end of the day, culture has to percolate down to every single employee in the company, even at the lowest level. And it's the job of the board to instill that culture in the senior management, and then the job of the senior management to pass that culture on to the lowest and the smallest employee.
My next question to you is in two parts. To what extent do you feel the real root cause of the problems for corporate governance that we've seen lie outside the company? And to what extent can the lawmakers and regulators be suitably empowered to ensure that abuses are checked and acted upon?
I think first of all, what causes governance failures is greed. So greed is it's a mindset. So as long as there is greed, there will be some degree of compliance failures. the board must have zero tolerance to compliance failures. And I think that ethics, that moral right, that the moral being, that everything has to be, that the highest level of integrity has to be practiced, that there must be accountability at every level, there must be transparency. These are the three principles: accountability, transparency, and integrity, which has to be drilled down in senior management and right down to every employee. Evaluation of boards, we don't take it that seriously in India. I'm on the board of a company in the UK, and they take it very, very seriously. So there are external agencies who come, they meet with each director, they actually sit in board meetings, they evaluate what is happening in board meetings, and then they give the report on the functioning of the board, and more specifically on each individual, how each individual is, what his strengths are, weaknesses are, and what the weakness of the board is.
And they take it seriously as well.
And they take it very seriously.
Yes, yes.
So it's a culture over there. In India, we don't take it that seriously.
We've heard Keki outline some fundamental aspects of board functioning. Stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. Atul, we've heard Keki outline some aspects in relation to the functioning of the boards in India. The question that I have is in terms of empowerment of regulatory bodies. And there I'd like you to highlight some instances that show how India measures up with the US, with reference to the SEC, with reference to the AICPA, and with reference to the PCAOB and any other monitoring authorities that exist in the US.
So if you look at the auditing profession in the United States, previously peer reviews were self-regulated. So you had the AICPA, which was conducting the necessary peer reviews and checking whether the audit quality, which was being provided by the audit firms, was adequate from an investor standpoint. In 2002, after the various debacles that we saw, we saw the Enron failure, we saw WorldCom and so on, we had the PCAOB, which came into being. Given that the mandate of the PCAOB was to ensure that audit quality is maintained, we now had a third party which was expected to come in and actually check the audit work papers of auditors. Whether that has been successful, I guess after 13 years, I believe that there has been a change. If we go back to 1933 and 1934, that was when the Security Exchange Commission came into being. And I guess one of the important differences of the role of the SEC vis-a-vis the role of SEBI could be that the SEC not only looks at initial filings, but it also comments on the regular filings which are done by a company. We have HDFC, which has got American Depository Receipts in the US, and what the SEC does effectively is that with respect to listed companies, it actually comments on the quality of disclosures in the financial statements. Investor protection is best met when the quality of the financial statements itself is such that it provides adequate material information for an investor to take an informed decision. So these two bodies are the ones that I would definitely highlight. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants continues to play a role which is definitely there for auditors who are auditing non-public companies. But when it comes to public companies, I guess the role played by the PCAOB is definitely something worth noting.
Right. Robin, what are your specific set of expectations from the management and board level committees in terms of detection and prevention of fraud and the overall fraud mitigating framework?
We need to understand what type of frauds take place. There are two types of frauds. One type of fraud is the micro fraud, and there is another type of fraud which is called the macro fraud. What is a micro fraud? Micro fraud involves cheating or theft by an employee at the company level. Another example of micro fraud is bribery, where the purchase department takes bribe and purchases goods at a higher price or inadequate quality. These are micro frauds. What are macro frauds? Macro frauds are doctoring the balance sheet and profit and loss account. Example, Satyam. Another example of macro fraud is where the company manufactures and produces suboptimal goods and services. What was promised to the customers were not produced. Example, Volkswagen. Another type of macro fraud is where the company actually runs a fraudulent practice. Its whole concept is incorrect and inappropriate. Example, a Ponzi scheme ran by, let's say, Sarada. So there are two types of frauds, micro frauds and macro frauds. So when you discuss what the board expects and should do in types of these two frauds, the matter of addressing micro fraud is much simpler than the concept of macro fraud. When it comes to micro fraud, where a cheating or a theft is taking place at the ground level, there are three action plans, in my view, needs to be taken. One, strengthen the internal control process. If the internal control process is strong and the board is of the view that it is very good, chances are that these frauds will be detected. Number two, not only it is good to have an internal control, but you need to do a management audit or the audit of the internal controls, which is in terminology called internal audit or management audit. And the third one, in order to identify whether they are incorrect or incorrect things are taking place in the company, encourage whistleblower policy. Yes. If these three steps, internal control, management audit, and encourage whistleblower takes place, in my view, the board will be better placed to identify micro frauds. Be as it may be, the problem with us is the macro frauds. The problem here is most of the board members attend a board meeting once a quarter. Now when you talk about board responsibilities and duties, you need to distinguish the two between executive board members and non-executive board members. Executive board members run the company on day-to-day basis. So he or she or they know what's happening within the organization. If there is a micro fraud taking place, they would better know that there's something going wrong. But the problem is of the independent or the most important is the non-executive directors. How do they understand a macro fraud is taking place? So therefore, not only that they should meet in the board meetings, attend the board meetings, which is only once a quarter, but they should have a regular dialogue with the top management. This is very important. And they must also ensure that the management quality is very good. They must ensure that normal hanky-pankies are not taking place in the organization. Number three, a visit to the factories or the service centers by the board members are important. If they visit those places, they would actually know, is something basically going wrong? Number four, the board is as good as its implementation. Now how, especially the non-executive board members who are attending the board meetings only once a quarter, know that something is going wrong or something is not going wrong? So the internal audit department or internal control or the management audit needs to be very important in the scheme of things. So if the board ensures the internal audit team or the internal auditors are really independent, capable and professionally qualified to do a job, it would go a long way in helping them to identify so-called inappropriateness taking place. In summary, micro frauds, easy to solve. Macro frauds, difficult to do. However, if the executive board members are involved in either of the two, God help the non-executive directors.
You've seen how well Robin has articulated the subject matter of fraud, giving certain best practices in the process. Robin spoke about independence. Stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. And now the debate gets even more interesting. Keki, we heard Robin speak about independence. You're on the board of several companies, and you're a change manager and a catalyst for change on the board. With audit rotation coming up in 2017, one of the aspects that companies are seeking to explore is the possibility of swapping the roles of the internal auditor vis-a-vis the statutory auditor. Could you outline some important aspects relating to independence in the selection of a new statutory auditor?
Obviously, auditors have to be independent. I mean, there's no question of a doubt about that. I'm not personally very sanguine or very believe that it is necessary to rotate the audit firm. I'm not sure in how many countries audit firms are rotated. You may know better than me.
I'll bring Atul in on that later.
But my sense is that it's more important to rotate an audit partner, not because there is compliance or there is some kind of relationship between the auditor and the management, not because of that, but what happens is with the same auditor year after year, some degree of complacency sets in. So to remove that complacency, you bring in a new partner. But to change the audit firm by itself, I'm not too sure it's such a great idea. It's my personal opinion. Having said that, if it is there in law, it is there in law, and we have to follow the law. And when we have to follow the law, we have to follow not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And if you are following the spirit of the law, then changing, converting or making an internal auditor, the external auditor, and an external auditor, internal auditor, to my mind is not going to serve any purpose. But again, speaking, giving a personal view, my view is that this change could have probably come a little later, because India is now in the midst of moving to a India system. In the India system, you need some experience. You need people who know the system well enough.
And some stability.
And you need stability. And more importantly, businesses are not as simple as people would like to believe them. There are very complex businesses. And for a new audit firm to come in and to understand the complexity of the business in the first few months is very honestly asking too much. So it would be much more realistic for the changeover, the transition process, the old audit firm to continue. Once the transition is over, once India's has been adopted, then probably we could have looked at changing the auditors. But the law is law, we have to abide by the law.
Let me bring you in on that point, Atul. Audit rotation in India. I'm sure the United States of America has its own set of good practices when it comes to changing the auditor. KNAV is a leading firm servicing Indian companies in the US, so you know issues on both sides of the table. What, in your view, are some of the important practices that are taking place in the US that, to Keki's point, India can possibly learn from as far as audit rotation is concerned?
The US has had audit rotation, but it has been there in a different form. The form has been that the audit partner can typically continue in that role for a period of 5 years. Now, it's not just the audit partner, but even a concurring reviewer. So the partner and the concurring reviewer both need to move out at the end of every 5 years. There are additional laws which have been pushed in, which says that if there is a third partner who puts in certain number of hours on an audit, then in that case, even that person has to move out after every 7 years. More importantly, I would also say that the US has probably brought in a commercial angle to this aspect by stating that an audit partner cannot be remunerated for any non-audit services which are actually provided, if any, by an audit firm to a public company. So they've also taken away the incentives which might lead to a partner wanting to continue or conduct himself not in the best of the manners. So I guess that's where we are.
Robin, I'd like you to have the last word. The question is very broad, but let me outline a couple of concerns. An auditor is a watchdog, he's not a bloodhound. What do you expect from the auditor in terms of detection and prevention of fraud? And what are some of the aspects you'd like to highlight? So that's the second part to the question, in terms of what the lawmakers can do to aid in the process.
Two important changes have taken place of late. One, the word fraud, especially corporate fraud, has been defined for the first time in the Companies Act of 2013. There was no definition of fraud. This helps to a large extent what is fraud all about, which is nothing else but deceiving someone else. The second important change which has happened in India is the internal financial control, and the statutory auditors need to comment upon internal financial control. I believe this is a singular change which we as a community of users of balance sheet needs to be aware of. What does it imply? It implies that a statutory auditor needs to comment upon not only that there is an internal financial control in the organization, but actually it is working and it is effective. This, to my mind, if it is really followed, the so-called macro fraud and to some extent the micro ones will get highlighted. I always believe that auditor is some sort of an insider. He is looking at the papers, the numbers, the accounts in great detail. He also, or the auditor, has also access to the top management of the management team. Therefore, the auditor is talking all the time to the team who is manufacturing, producing, servicing this community at large. If there is something going wrong, and I call it the hanky-panky, I personally believe the auditor is always well placed to find out whether there is anything wrong going on or not. Therefore, the recent change of statutory auditors commenting on the internal financial control, if followed strictly and rightly, it will make a lot of difference to the commercial world. Now, so the statutory agencies have done their they have done their work. They have given the statutory auditors a responsibility to report on internal financial control. The work is now on the auditors to make it happen and to assure all users of the balance sheets that they are correct. The last word on this, if I am a user of a balance sheet and profit and loss account, I need to know that the piece of paper I have got is correct and there is no fraud inside. This is the only request and this is the only requirement I have from a piece of paper called the audited financial report.
Thank you, Robin, for those very useful insights, which brings us to the end of the second part of the KNAV State of Governance series. We started the discussion by touching upon some significant legislative developments. We extended the discussion to the moral and the ethical framework. We closed the discussion on a soft note in terms of the responsibilities of the statutory auditor. On that note, I must thank you, everyone, for being with us on the show today. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure having you with us. Thank you for watching.